And with that, I'd like to introduce our guests, Cooper Hollmaier from REI and Maya Hampton from REI, who will be getting into their presentation shortly.
Thanks for the introduction, Grace. We're really excited to be here to talk about design systems and accessibility and how the two can work together to amplify impact across a retail organization. My name's Cooper Hollmaier, like Grace alluded to, and I'm the product manager for accessibility at REI. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm joining the webinar from my home office here in Tacoma, Washington, which is on the traditional and unceded lands of the Coast Salish people. Maya?
Hi, everyone. Good to be here with you today. My name is Maya Hampton. I'm a Senior Digital Product Manager for REI, specifically working on our design system, which is called Cedar Design System. My pronouns are she, her, and I think we're ready to get going.
Sounds good. The Cedar Design System and accessibility teams collaborate to enable efficient creation of high quality, accessible, and durable customer experiences at scale. Before we get started, let's frame up the conversation with today's agenda. We've prepared roughly 35 minutes of material, like Grace alluded to, and there will be about 15 minutes in the end for an open question and answer session. We'll start by discussing the difficulty of convincing anyone to invest in something as nuanced as accessibility or a design system, and how you might prepare for and start the conversations necessary to point your organization towards a new and more inclusive future. Next, we'll provide a framework you can use to sell your vision to your colleagues, whether you're an engineer, designer, or some other role, and ultimately your company. Then we'll talk about how to mature your program and give you the tools you need to get close to your customers and keep your vision for accessibility alive. We'll talk in depth with Maya, the Senior Digital Product Manager of our design system, Cedar, and explore the systems thinking approach, walking you through how you can use existing systems at your disposal to scale accessibility across your entire retail organization. Last but not least, we'll talk about building and engaging folks in a culture of accessibility. And of course, we'll round out things with a list of resources and articles that we think you might find helpful as you embark on your journey. Let's get after it. Accessibility likely isn't something that has existed for years at your company, but that doesn't mean that you can't start aiming for a more inclusive future today. So here's a little bit about starting that conversation. Organizational change is hard. To many, accessibility is going to feel like an extra step or extra work at first, and you're likely to get some pushback for asking for more time, care, and code. A vital expectation to set early with your colleagues and executives is that shipping accessible products consistently won't take 30, 60, or 90 days. Instead, it's an effort that will take years to get right. And there's no one-size-fits-all approach to accessibility. At your company, accessibility might be a gap in your knowledge and skill sets. You might be one or part of a group of a few designers who want to ensure your designs will be usable by people with disabilities, or you might be dealing with litigation and want to ensure customers aren't negatively affected or upset ever again. Whatever the case, we're going to talk today about how to legitimize your work for the business and getting your business from an expensive and time-consuming reactive approach to a proactive way of working in which everyone on your teams is thinking about accessibility early and often. For the duration of this webinar, on the right-hand side of the screen here, we'll be making some assumptions. I'm sure that, I'm part of an empowered accessibility product team as the product manager at REI, but let's assume that you don't have an empowered product team dedicated to accessibility. You might be a software engineer, designer, accessibility specialist, marketer, or in some other role. You desire to convince your retail organization to think more proactively about accessibility, recognizing that you alone can't tackle that challenge by yourself. You'll need to do two essential things to start accelerating your company culture from one that views accessibility as a volunteer, fast follow, or unimportant effort towards one that considers inclusive participation as the expectation. Those two things are research and relationship building. Do the research. Let's start with it. Let's start with research as this first talking point. When I was building the case for accelerating accessibility in my current role, I knew I needed to understand the landscape better and what happened before my time. I'd recommend that you do the same. Learn about your company's history with accessibility, including its attitudes, litigation, and anything else you can find. Next, focus on the groups inside your business already working towards your similar goals. These groups could include diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts or less formal affinity groups. Learning the history and the landscape from within your company can help you understand what mistakes to avoid and how to best influence change moving forward. Once you have a broad understanding of accessibility at your company, pay attention to and consider 4 audience types: your customers, the company, your industry, and your competition. Paying attention to what your customers are saying is critical to reducing and removing their accessibility barriers. These sound bites are incredibly potent when speaking with an executive audience because they're coming straight from the folks that keep the business open. Understanding how your company is performing and its goals can help you ladder up accessibility into business strategy. If you're successful, the accessibility work that you want to do is how the business succeeds rather than another priority that gets in the way of the business meeting its goals. Knowing how accessible the industry, likely retail in your case, as a whole can be a good talking point and a way for you to differentiate yourself in the marketplace. If most folks encounter inaccessible experiences, for example, when buying a car, but your dealership and website are accessible, you now have a competitive advantage. Similarly, assessing the accessibility of your competitors can be a convincing argument to an executive if you're leading or lagging in that space. Having deep insights into each group will ultimately make your case more persuasive when you're ready to present your vision. One last piece of advice as you're researching: think about the customer through a qualitative and quantitative lens. Crafting a vision for accessibility at your company that appeals to both the hearts and minds will require both approaches. You'll need to do a little bit more than research to move the business in the right direction, though. Building strategic relationships inside and outside your company will give you the credibility and influence you'll need to have a real impact. One remarkable thing about working in accessibility is that most folks are willing to talk shop with you, unlike many other disciplines. In my experience, these relationships with people in similar roles at other companies can provide you with great connections, mistakes you should avoid, preferred vendors, and tactics to build advocacy for your work. Additionally, leveraging these relationships, I validated our own accessibility product vision and benchmarked our progress against other companies. LinkedIn can be a great way to find people to connect with. When I was new to the industry, I used LinkedIn to make a list of about 30 to 40 people that I wanted to learn from, and I messaged them directly. I found that by looking for directors, product managers, program managers, and specialists with accessibility, inclusion, or usability in their titles was a good way to start making this list. I'll admit that not everyone agreed to meet with me, but those who did improved my career and the success of our accessibility work exponentially. You folks know who you are, and thank you so much for helping all of us make a more significant difference for real people. One note about contacting people you don't know: always have a vision and specific questions prepared ahead of time. This will help the conversation stay on topic and make for a productive meeting. Additionally, it's important to remember that people's time, including your own, has value. Always offer to compensate someone if they're willing to take time out of their day to chat with you about something like accessibility, or really anything for that matter. In addition to making friends outside of your immediate orbit, the company you keep at work can make or break your push for accessibility. I was fortunate to move laterally from an SEO team to work on accessibility. This meant that I already had enterprise-wide relationships that I could leverage and start pushing on accessibility, but you might not have the same advantage. The people and processes that I knew helped me understand who our supporters were, who needed some extra convincing, and who is a great resource if we didn't know where to go next. Building relationships across your business and outside of it can provide you the path to executive support, more priority, influence, resources, and funding, as well as the potential of limiting your work and risk to the business over time by enabling you to integrate with existing systems and amplify your impact, as we'll talk with Maya later. The strategic group of folks I think that can really catapult your accessibility initiatives forward are customer service, human resources, legal, leaders in your online and in-store commerce teams. All of these people are part of my steering committee and provide critical and unique value to the program. Selling the vision. Once you've taken the temperature on accessibility at your company, you've built your strategic partnerships, it's time to turn all of those insights into action. Use what you know and the list of folks I mentioned in the last slide to assemble a key stakeholders group or steering committee. This can be a relatively informal group at first, but should be a mix of folks from across the organization who have a vested interest in your success and those who have the influence and authority to help you make progress. If you have one important additional member of the group is someone from your design system team. As Maya will share in more detail later, working with a design system team can help you leverage existing systems and build advocacy for your work more efficiently. All right, you have a steering committee. It's time to sell the vision. And you already know a ton about accessibility, both inside and outside your company. What do you do now? Accessibility work is never over. People and products change. The best thing you can do is to serve your customers, is to develop a long-term vision for what accessibility should be at your company. For me, I made my vision into an easily digestible presentation. For you, the format could be the same or completely different. Regardless of the shape of the box, it's the contents that matter, and the content should be the same. And your timeline for your vision should be roughly 2 to 10 years out, not something we're going to complete tomorrow. Step 1 is I would start with an introduction that demonstrates your knowledge and credibility in 1 to 3 slides, including the title. Number 2, an executive summary that clearly and concisely articulates your ideas in 5 to 10 slides. I'll mention here that the introduction and the executive summary are the only pieces of the presentation that you'll actually need to present to someone. Step 3 is the supplemental slides that won't be presented, but dive deeper into the ideas you presented in the summary if you're asked questions. The supplemental slides is where you're going to be able to dive into if there's additional questions that will inevitably come up. And the appendix should include any additional data or information to back up your case. Notice in an earlier slide, I said, look at customers from a qualitative and quantitative lens. This is where your appendix will really come in handy, making sure that you have the data and the numbers to back up your case. The one resource I come back to again and again for making compelling presentations is the SEO MBA by Tom Critchlow. Tom is an independent consultant helping businesses define and build digital marketing capabilities. Even if you're not doing search engine optimization, using his model, which he laid out in an article we'll link to at the end of the presentation called Good Slides Reduce Complexity, will make your presentation sing to an executive audience. The key to bringing a compelling case to a group of people is simplicity. You should be able to set the stage, define your problem, and articulate a viable solution or ask in 13 slides or less. Influencing others and gaining support of your steering committee and beyond is more than structure of the presentation, though. You have to really tell a good story. On this slide, I've included the steps to telling a good story, as well as some potential examples you could be looking at. Start by building your credibility with your audience. This should be, like I mentioned before, in the first 1 to 3 slides of your presentation. Convey to them that what makes you especially qualified to talk about this subject. It could be the folks and companies you've connected with, your understanding of the business strategy and goals, a class you took, or something else. As you've taken the time to get to know your colleagues, you'll have a better idea of what they believe makes a person credible. Next, we'll move on to the executive summary for slides 2, 3, and 4. This should be about 5 to 10 slides, but can take a different form depending on your circumstances. Define the problem that you are uniquely able to solve for the business with the right help. How does the business measure success in the short and long term? You might want to convey that you are a subject matter expert in accessibility and how you will make it easier to reach those success metrics for the business. You'll want to do this by appealing to both hearts and minds. Use everyday language with your stakeholders that they're using right now to describe their work, and include both customer testimonials and reliable numbers related to how your problem impacts customers by failing to think about people with disabilities from the beginning. Step 3 is all about your ask, proposing a solution. Here's where you need to clearly articulate what you believe will help eliminate accessibility barriers for your customers and reduce friction as the business reaches for its goals. It's okay to think big and outside the box here, but ensure that your ask sets you up for a durable future. And step 4, lay out the benefits of your ask. Say you asked for a team of individuals to work on accessibility. What will that new headcount and focus unlock for the business? This stage is often referred to as the so what. This slide should relate to the big problem defined and shouldn't hint at a short-term payout, but rather a long-term strategy and continuous dividends. As you craft your story, think carefully about your audience. Your introduction and executive summary should resonate with the folks that hold positions of authority and be concise and to the point. No one should leave the meeting asking what your ask was. They should know it down cold. You won't explicitly present your supplemental slides or the appendix. Your work on these is to have answers to questions ready when they come your way. Here comes the moment of truth. Does your stakeholder team give you the go-ahead and agree to support you? Suppose you got a yes. Congratulations, you've taken a critical step to advancing accessibility at your company, and that's no small feat, and it is no small impact on people either. Retail companies have a broad reach and a considerable impact on many people's lives. If there's hesitation or you get a no on your proposed vision, dig in deep to find out why. Likely your effort won't be lost. You'll just need to gather more information, reframe the problem, and try again. Try not to get discouraged. If they did say yes, it's start executing on a vision you've proposed and figure out how you'll measure the success and failure of accessibility at your company over time. It's natural and healthy to change your plan from what you presented based on what you test, fail at, and learn from as you move forward towards a future state. It's worth mentioning that the conversation succeeding your pitch won't be this binary. It won't be a yes or no, and it's okay if the group lands somewhere in the middle. You're still making a difference for people with disabilities, even if you have to take smaller steps and iterate to get there. Maturity. You've convinced your stakeholder group to invest in your vision. Now it's time to go big and work towards your goals. Distributing accountability. If you're working at a large retailer, there are likely dozens of customer touch points that need to be accessible. Regardless of the resources you have at your disposal, the work ahead is likely too extensive for a single person or team to tackle effectively. If you proceed without making a change, it's likely that there will be an influx of requests, and I can say this from experience, for accessibility help when you have 3 or 4 fewer folks to field it. That's not sustainable. A model that seems to work well for many companies, and something I learned when I was talking to folks outside of my own role and own company, is distributing accountability for accessibility. Each team ensures their product and experience is accessible. This will remove quality assurance work from your plate and allow you to focus on big picture enterprise problems rather than minor bugs and audit remediation. However, it does not stop many teams from reaching out for help for accessibility, and you become a bottleneck to shipping accessible products quickly when you're relying on just a few accessibility efforts or experts to support this many teams and stores if you're talking about in-store retail. This is where building competency comes into play. To solve this problem, eliminate bottleneck, increase efficiency, and ultimately improve the customer experience consistently, you must build accessibility competency across the enterprise. Rather than a single point for employees to refer to for help with building accessible and inclusive experiences, you now have accessibility knowledge embedded in every team. In the graphic on the right, for example, the designer on the team is now an accessibility subject matter expert in addition to being responsible for the team's design needs. This structure enables the team to work seamlessly without an additional dependency on an external accessibility expert. That's not to say that your accessibility team or a group of folks or subject matter experts no longer matter. It just means that they have to ask for help less frequently because they have the skill set that they need to act on accessibility effectively. Additionally, the more of your fellow employees that learn to empathize, design, and code for inclusivity, the more that it will melt into the background, meaning it's no longer that extra thing, accessibility that is, it's no longer that extra thing at the end, but the way that we built it from the beginning. I'm always so excited when someone speaks up and mentions something new that they're working on and the prototype has all the signs of being designed with all instead of simply adding features for all. It's a great feeling. The work doesn't stop there once you've got the people involved and the right systems in place. To build a sustainable accessibility program that continuously delivers inclusive outcomes for your customers, you have to know your customers and employees well. Any large-scale accessibility effort should build a sense of empowerment amongst creators, the folks coding and designing and writing, etc., and consumers, your external-facing customers. You can achieve this by talking to or surveying them directly. You could message or schedule meetings with individuals to learn about their accessibility knowledge, complaints, and friction points, or send out a survey for folks to fill out. Still, all of these options take away precious time from the workday. We approached building our own roadmap in what turned out to be a less time-consuming and more anonymous way. We attended large group meetings, parsed through 3 years of accessibility-related voice of customer comments, and used a whiteboarding tool, despite its accessibility issues, to gather feedback from each type of customer. We then converted this feedback into user stories. And you can see sort of an example of this on the right. We've also included an example board for you to consume in the deck in the resources section at the end of this slide deck. This approach allowed us to visualize real customer problems by segment. The visibility was both validating and eye-opening. By getting feedback directly from our customers and employees in each of their individual roles, we minimized risk. The risk that the solutions we came up with weren't valuable, they weren't usable by our employees, they weren't technically feasible, and that they would be a risk to the business. The result, after doing all of this work, was a validated plan to seamlessly integrate accessibility into the workflows of many teams across the business that shifted accountability from subject matter experts to individual teams, and ultimately would build broad accessibility knowledge and deliver durable and inclusive outcomes for customers. You can try it yourself by checking out the example board in the resource section of the slide deck. But that only solves accessibility barriers at the team level. I'm going to pass it over to Maya to talk about using systems like the Cedar Design System to scale and amplify impact with durable solutions. Take it away, Maya.
Thanks, Cooper. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we've utilized systems at REI to distribute accessible solutions across all of our digital channels. Systems thinking really represents a shift in mindset away from linear to more circular. And the fundamental principle of this shift is that everything is interconnected and everything's intentional, which is kind of what's summed up in this quote here from Danella Meadows. Design systems in particular can help to provide a foundation for everyone that's creating products and experiences for end users. If you're unfamiliar, design systems are usually comprised of a central component library for common user-facing elements. So think of buttons, links, input fields, etc., as well as usage guidelines for these elements and common user experience patterns. By creating reusable code components that can be shared across multiple digital teams, we can help improve efficiency for those teams so they don't have to start from scratch with each new design iteration. And as you might know or can imagine, all of these interactive elements have accessibility considerations for best usability, as well as requirements to meet WCAG standards. Our design system team at REI is fortunate to have an accessibility subject matter expert who has advocated for building these accessibility requirements into our components and guidelines. So then as our system has grown and gained more adoption, more teams are able to benefit from the work that our team has done and really dedicated to building out those accessible solutions in the first place. And this reusability is the key to scale. A great example to help understand the impact of leveraging a design system for accessibility in particular is by looking at one of the most common UI elements, a button. So you can see in the screenshots here of a REI product page, you could have 6 different instances of a product page or other listing page or marketing page with a button that visually looks the same or very similar. But if they're built by different teams or at different times, they could have different accessibility issues. For example, one could be missing a focus state, one doesn't meet color contrast standards, one's missing support for tab navigation, etc. Now, typically, individual product teams will test the functionality for their specific page and remediate any accessibility issues that arise on a case-by-case basis. But the issue with that is that it really keeps us in that reactive state. It doesn't solve for the issue on another page, and it doesn't guarantee the fix will stay in place after the next design iteration. So by having a dedicated system team that is willing to go through the literally sometimes hundreds of requirements and thorough testing to create a button that solves for all of these considerations, and a system in place to help distribute that button across a website or other digital channels as well, we can ensure not only better quality for our end customers, but we can help to end those cycles of remediation, really being able to move from that reactive state to a more proactive state. And then if an accessibility issue does get flagged on a button in the design system, or there's a brand update to the color that's used on the primary buttons, now we have a single source of accountability within that design system, which enables us to make the change in one place and then distribute that change widely. And so that's really the beauty of leveraging systems. Rather than requiring each team to design and build buttons, we can make those decisions one time and package them up into reusable design and code. And then in the future, updates can be made in one place and the change will propagate out to all consumers of the design system. Here's kind of just a quick visual showing that. And I will say, if you don't have a design system yet or just getting one running, solving for common accessibility hurdles is really a great way to build adoption and drive adoption, get people to want to use the system because you're helping solving problems for them. Now, while there's a lot that a design system team can build into shared components, ultimately we can't do everything for product teams. Product teams are our partners, and when they're building digital experiences, they need to ensure that they're being compliant with accessibility when they're implementing our components. So there's really a shared responsibility here. We try to make that explicit in our documentation and when we're communicating with those teams. So for an example, the design system can provide an image component that has an empty alt attribute, but the team that's actually implementing that image onto a page needs to write and include the actual alt text. And in our documentation, we have a number of these examples broken out, as well as at the component level, really trying to spell out what the design system does and what the consuming or implementing team is responsible for. An accessible component is really an important foundation for accessibility at scale. But there are many other things that can make an experience more accessible that really requires the product designer and engineer to think through the need and implement an inclusive design. At REI, like Cooper spoke to, we've really helped to build advocacy from the ground up with volunteers who are really passionate champions for accessibility and have helped form not only our design system team, but now also a dedicated accessibility team. Some more tactical ways that we've had success with that could maybe help your digital teams also build advocacy for accessible solutions could include empathy moments. So for example, we've had hosted webinars where we've watched a sight impaired user navigate through our website, try to do something like add a product to cart and check out and narrate their experience. And that's been really enlightening. You can kind of see the light bulbs going off in people's minds as they see how somebody not only interacts with the site as a full journey, as opposed to just running through a test before publishing new code. I definitely would recommend those. We also have office hours that are really dedicated weekly time to ask questions to subject matter experts about specific implementation challenges and general ideas or suggestions that they might have or might want to share with other teams as well. And then also building support channels out in, we use both Slack and Teams. So there's really an opportunity to get in the moment support from accessibility, subject matter experts again, or even crowdsourced solutions. And it's really great to see a community start to form and start to drive that shared accountability and responsibility.
Woo, we've thrown a lot of stuff at you all today. So let's wrap it up and get to some Q&A. Thanks for that, Maya. First off, kind of starting with the conversation and starting the conversation about accessibility at your retail organization. It's really about kind of recognizing that organizational change is hard and doing some thorough research and relationship building to really set you up on the path for success. When you're looking to sell your vision, turning your insights into action by assembling a steering committee can be really helpful, and creating a compelling case to invest in accessibility. You should only need about 13 slides to be persuasive to an executive audience if you're doing it right, and your vision should span about 2 to 10 years, recognizing that accessibility can't be solved overnight. In terms of maturity, once you've gotten the investment, distributing the accountability and building competency can help you remove accessibility barriers for customers now and proactively avoid them in the future. Systems thinking, as Maya spoke to, a design system can be a powerful way to leverage existing systems to distribute and encourage durable accessibility solutions across the enterprise. And creating resiliency. Accessibility work is never done, as most of you, if not all of you, already know. Continuous education, empathy moments, weekly office hours, and instant messaging support for in-the-moment support can ensure your advocates stay engaged in achieving your vision together. So we have some resources here for you at the end. The Good Slides Reduce Complexity model from Tom Critchlow, a example board of our customer problems that we use to kind of poll our internal customers in terms of their friction points and what they think we could do to make accessibility better at the company. And then Maya has a couple links here for the Cedar Design System and specifically accessibility, which are open source and public for you to view. Anything you want to add on links, Maya, or do you feel good about that list? Awesome, thumbs up. With that, we'll take some questions. I think we'll probably hand it back over to Grace to facilitate.
Yes, so great presentation, Cooper. Great presentation, Maya. Let's get into some of your questions here. So first question from Lindsay asks, where have you been able to find metrics on the accessibility of other organizations within your industry?
That's a good question. I don't necessarily think we've found metrics on other companies. I think a lot of the conversations that I had initially about accessibility with those parties and kind of had those coffee chats, I think I learned a lot about how other companies were doing and what was working and what wasn't. So I don't know that I had specific metrics or really deep insights into how that impacted even business metrics like revenue or traffic or things like that. And it's really hard to come by statistics, as most of you probably know. So it was more so the off the cuff, off the wall conversations we had that I could get a feel for, what was going well, what wasn't at those companies.
Awesome, thank you. And just a reminder for people who are asking, the slides with the resources will be sent around along with the recording. So look out for an email from myself coming within the next week or so with those helpful links. All right, next question here from Charlie. How do you handle this conversation with product owner, product manager, devs who poorly implemented a feature? So they're saying, we followed the component library, how can we still have accessibility issues?
I'll let Maya hop on here, but I think one thing I'll say is I think the empathy moments specifically are a great way to show how walking through a flow on your website or a flow in person, and having really a diverse and unique lived experience and showing that to other people is what kind of set off the light bulbs for people. I think once people have seen an empathy moment, they're really invested and understand, how does this apply to the work that I'm doing? I think that's the first step. But Maya, do you have anything to add about design systems specifically and the inclusive kind of holistic experience?
Yeah, no, I agree that kind of the inclusive design principles are a really important part of it, but yeah, implementation often comes down to the details. And honestly, I would say there's really an ongoing conversation. We try not to make it too much of a blame game. So if an issue does come up at accessibility, we want them to reach out to the design system team if they feel like it's an issue with the component. We're not perfect. We miss some things. There's new requirements that come out. So we're happy to work with them to, resolve that issue within the system so we can then share that out to everyone else. Maybe it's just a matter of adding some clarifying content in our documentation to better describe how to more properly implement a component. And sometimes it is on the consuming team if they override a component or try to do something a little bit out of the box. The design system can't solve for every possible use case. So we really just try to keep that conversation going. Again, like Cooper mentioned, have those resources available so that, teams feel free to reach out. Hey, something seems, got flagged in my, accessibility test. I'm not quite sure because I think I'm using it right. And really just kind of keep that more of a conversation between teams.
Fantastic, thank you, Maya. So here's a probably big question. How do you report on your progress with your digital accessibility efforts?
That's a good question. I think, like many of you, we are still, building and learning and testing. I don't think there's a perfect solution at the moment for measuring it. There's a lot of great tools. I'll throw out DQ and Axe Monitor that provides a good overview of how things are going in terms of compliance. But I think the things that I've learned as I've gotten more into this world and this work is that it really is a multifaceted approach that you have to take, not only just compliance with the standards set out by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but also, what does that mean for the end user and their actual experience, and is that usable and inclusive? And so I think measuring it, you have to look at compliance, you have to look at usability, and I would encourage everyone here to also be considering like user testing as you're building out your products. So like making sure that you're talking to folks with disabilities, talking to folks with unique lived experiences, and getting their take on things as you're building things versus at the end. That's kind of what my answer would be.
Thank you. And I guess to piggyback off of that, off of your response, Cooper, another question here asks about the implementation of user research and testing on participants who are using different assistive technology within REI.
Yeah, I think you have to, as you look at accessibility holistically, whether it's talking about a team that you're working with or even a design system, I think it's important to look at the entire picture. So I think I don't necessarily want to throw out particular vendors, but I want to say that like I think it's a very important thing for you to do to be user testing and including that as part of your strategy. One thing that I did early on was I said, okay, we're gonna talk about continuous education. We're gonna talk about getting user testing to include folks with disabilities in that user testing flow, regardless of the vendor you choose to use to do that. And then all the way down to the the code level where you're making efficiencies and building an automated testing. So I think you really have to take a holistic approach. It's something that we're actively pursuing now, but I wouldn't say that we're perfect at it, and we're still learning.
Awesome, thank you. And thanks everybody for your great questions. I'm having a hard time picking, there's so many. So here's a question for Maya. What does accessibility testing of the design system itself look like for your team?
Yeah, that's a great question. So to start, and I saw there was another question too about kind of how do we technically build accessibility into the components. So I will say we do a lot of work up front to review WCAG guidelines. The W3C also has a ton of information about common design patterns and those interactive elements. So we really try to do a lot of that work up front to understand what are the interaction states that need to be provided? What are the color contrasts? What are the different ARIA labels that might be used or not? And really tried to build those into the requirements to get going. And then for testing, it's a bit tricky, I will say, because we can often test the components within just kind of that isolated world of the component. So we can do some unit testing. We have kind of a kitchen sink page that we call it, where we'll put our components up and we can run just some common tests on. But then that's again, I'd say where there's really a shared partnership with the implementing teams as they actually put those components onto the live website. They're really responsible for making sure that everything is integrated properly and taking advantage of the more comprehensive testing solutions and test cases that their teams develop to make sure that everything is kind of playing nicely and working against those requirements.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning here that accessibility testing, you can't do it just in an automated fashion. There has to be a little bit of manual testing involved too. So that kind of varies from team to team that you'll probably work with in your experience in a retail org. But I would say making sure that you're not just relying 100% on automated testing, but that you're also talking to folks with disabilities, talking to people with unique lived experiences, and getting them to check out the experiences for you all up and holistically will take you a long way. So the automated versus manual, I think, is a good distinction to make there too.
Great point. So Cooper, in your slides, when you were talking about presenting accessibility goals, you mentioned that some you will want to plan for many years out. And while short-term goals, 1 or 2 years, are easier to make, how do you make the distinction between short-term and long-term goals? And how do you create those long-term goals in general when you're first starting?
Yeah, I think as someone who's very passionate about accessibility ever since it was sparked in me in 2019, I was ready to hit the ground running and do everything, make everything as accessible as possible. And then I think I realized that working at a big company or even a small company, like organizational change is hard, and I alone could not, along with the partners that I had at the time, could not make the change happen as quickly as we wanted to. And I think I sort of had this humbling moment where I recognized that we had to kind of piecemeal this out. So I think I start with the goal big, and then start to realize how you can achieve that and what the time frame really looks like realistically. Short-term goals, I would say, as you're sort of moving from a reactive, like audit-based and remediation-based approach to something that's more proactive, is start by figuring out how to make that audit process more streamlined, how to take results and get teams to work on them. I think that's step one. Step two is then figuring out, how do I start to educate people and provide them with the resources to be able to catch these issues before they become a problem. And I think the education piece is like the step two, and that's, I would say, primarily where we're at right now. And then kind of step 3 and 4 and 5 is, like, how do I automate the things I can automate? How do I start to build in tooling to make this easier? But I think really the first couple of steps there are making the audit and the remediation stuff easier than it is today. And then step 2 is educating folks for the future. Everything else really is long-term. It's stuff that you probably could do today, but like, I think you'll realize as you get into it, the more advocacy and the people and the relationship building that you've done and sort of get momentum behind accessibility, the easier the stuff that's in the long term will be, and the quicker it'll actually be coming to fruition.
Excellent. In a similar vein, this person asked, can you speak more to the reactive versus proactive practices mentioned throughout the presentation?
Yeah, I think reactive is, and I think Maya might have some stuff to add here too, but I would say reactive to me is your company is recognizing accessibility barriers in your digital and your in-person, built environment products after they've already gone to market. And so most of your work today might be remediation. So finding those issues, those barriers, and fixing them after they've already impacted a customer. Something that is proactive, and kind of what your goal, I think, should be, is moving towards a model that allows people to recognize, the potential barriers that might come to fruition down the line, and designing and coding and really planning for them as you're building the product so that they don't ever go to market. That's a more proactive approach. I don't think any company is perfect at proactivity and moving that direction, but I think that the sooner you can get away from just audit and remediation after it, the less time, money, and headaches that you'll have from dealing with accessibility too late in that process, rather than continuously throughout, and distributing accountability to every person in that step of the process to getting a product out the door.
Awesome, thank you. Oh, Maya, did you have anything to add there?
No, I think that captures it great. It's really just about trying to break that cycle of, we did an accessibility audit, we have all these issues to solve. Okay, we solved these issues, we're good. We can back burner this for a while and do something else. Switching from that mindset to more incorporating it into more just common practices and thinking in the day-to-day.
Yeah, accessibility less as an item on a prioritized list, and more about how you're accomplishing those things on the list. So rather than being the what, being the how, I think is sort of how I would describe moving from reactive to proactive.
Excellent. Another question, I believe, for Maya here. How do you communicate changes that are made to the design system? Meaning, how do you communicate those changes to product teams that will in turn build the components?
Great question. Yeah, so our design system has a quarterly release cycle. So we typically release major changes not too frequently throughout the year. So when we do have a large release, we'll bundle a lot of stuff together. We'll send out release notes, we'll document that on our website, and we'll do a demo that kind of goes through everything that's changed. So we try to keep kind of common communication out there. When we do smaller patch releases, occasionally we'll get support questions, or somebody will find more of a minor bug through and report it to us through one of our support channels. And so we'll communicate right back out when that gets fixed and try to get those out sooner than the big packaged releases. So try to just keep open line communications, as well as having a predictable release cadence so teams know when to look out for new information.
Awesome, thank you. Next question here. What methods have you used in training and upskilling your product teams on baking accessibility into your products? What kinds of tools are you using to do this?
Yeah, continuing education, I think, is one of the keys to keeping people engaged, keeping people in the know, and like ultimately, I think making the job of an accessibility team, for example, easier. The ways that we've sort of, I think, we've sort of added education and kind of made it a little bit less noisy in people's schedules is by integrating it into our office hours. So for a while here at the end of 2021 and into 2022, we kind of played around with the idea of making half of our office hours sort of consulting, and then making the other half of our office hours sort of a presentation on a common topic that people were struggling to understand or wanted to learn more about. So that's one way that we kind of leveled up education. I think there's a bunch of different ways that you at a company could approach it. You could look at integrating accessibility into your onboarding documentation and training. You could look at scheduling sort of lunch and learn type of events as well. But I think for us, working at a big company, I think you'll find that there's a lot of meetings on your calendar, and finding ways to get education either asynchronously through some self-serve methods or getting it integrated into an existing meeting as an agenda item is probably going to be more successful, and ultimately have people be more engaged because they're not having to juggle around schedules and schedule something else on their calendar. It's part of something they're already doing. So you'll see the sort of mindset shift from this extra thing to I'm already doing this. Let's talk about accessibility. Tooling is another question you asked. We don't use a tremendous amount of tooling in terms of that educational piece. I think the Microsoft suite is quite accessible and provides a lot of options in terms of like developing presentations and ensuring that we're providing the right text alternatives and things like that. But I wouldn't say we're super heavy on the tooling, but there's a ton of great options out there if you want to train more accessibly and provide more inclusive content.
Excellent, thank you for that. Another attendee asks about tools, software and hardware. What would you recommend for testing and implementation?
Maya, do you have any things on the Cedar side that you use for testing and implementation specifically? Then I can jump in.
I know we use a lot of kind of just common screen reader and color contrast tools available online. Maybe we can add some of those resources to the deck.
Yeah, I mean, we also use Axe DevTools Pro pretty heavily from DQ. That's not a pitch for DQ, but it's a tool that we use. And yeah, like we find that the best way to test things is either test them with folks with disabilities who are willing to kind of work with us and obviously be compensated for their time, or through a user testing module. Additionally, I think testing pages and tools, it's something that you could use a variety of suite of tools to do, but using the actual screen reader technology versus maybe a simulation, I think is the way to go. I found that using VoiceOver, using NVDA, using JAWS to effectively test things amongst other types of disabilities as well. Screen reader is not the only option there. Is super beneficial, using keyboard navigation, etc. So I think a lot of the manual testing, I would say, is done on a keyboard, on a screen reader, on other types of assistive technology that we have at our disposal to be able to test it with a real device. I think is probably how I would sum up the testing specifically.
Super, thank you for that. Another question here. Is there anything unique to the retail sector that makes accessibility particularly challenging? And any data that you know of that speaks to that?
I don't have any data off the top of my head, but I will say that, yeah, I think working in a retail business is challenging from an accessibility perspective, but in terms of a technology perspective as well. There's a bunch of software and services that make up any retailer's product page, for example. There's a lot of data coming in and out, and search functionality specifically too on like search pages for a retailer. There's a lot of faceted navigation and different data that's coming in and out when you're using keyword search. So I think it does make it incredibly difficult because you really have to think about not only what's happening visually on the screen, but what underlying accessibility attributes you need to make sure that are exposed, and making sure that the way that you're building that page is going to kind of give everyone an equivalent or adequate experience, and leave no one behind. So I think, yeah, like search pages and product pages specifically, and then really any company, it could be a retailer or not, like using media is really tough. I think understanding which of your videos and your audio clips and what have you, images, are decorative and which are not decorative, and what you really need to make sure that you're careful about in terms of using motion. I think those three things, media and motion, along with product pages and search pages, do make it a little bit more complex.
Absolutely. Another question here about ensuring that HR is hiring devs and designers with accessibility expertise. The question is, how do you educate your HR personnel, or what might be your recommendations so that accessibility SMEs or people with accessibility experience are hired into a company?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say don't scope things like empathy moments or trainings to only a digital designer, software engineer, QA tester, content writer audience. Really scope it broad and get everyone that you can at your company involved in accessibility. I think people are always looking for like the prescriptive solution, but I think really the more you expose to people and get people to recognize that the way the status quo, for example, is exclusionary in the way that it's being done today. I think a lot of people will naturally have a light bulb that goes off and say, I'm going to change the way that I do something, or I'm going to learn more about this thing. And so I think it's really about creating the spark for everyone at your company, not just the folks who are actively today embedded on and working on accessibility barriers. Because as you get more proactive, I think you'll realize more people, that are farther outside of the realm of the code that's being put on the page, for example, are going to be excited and actively and proactively talking about that and making changes.
Absolutely.
Also, your steering committee should probably have someone from HR and legal and marketing and some of these other groups that you're probably asking about in terms of inclusive hiring, but also inclusive marketing and really living your company's values in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which includes accessibility.
That's a great add and a great reminder to make sure that accessibility is not just one team's responsibility, but across the organization. All right, we have about 4 minutes left. I think we can sneak in 1 or 2 more questions. Again, thank you everybody for your excellent questions and participation. This has been really great. So this attendee writes, it's really awesome that your Cedar Design System team has bought into the idea of accessibility being their responsibility. Our design system team thinks accessibility teams need to be the one fixing all of the accessibility problems. How would you recommend trying to change minds?
Yeah, that's tricky. And I've been fortunate to, as I mentioned earlier, we really had that role on our team from the get-go. So that's kind of always been part of what we believed. And our team was around before we had an accessibility team. So it was like a volunteer effort to really make it happen. But if I was to recommend, how to go about changing the minds of that, I think trying to approach it as a partnership. So now, Cooper's accessibility team and my team as well, we work together. If they're working on an audit or if they're seeing common issues across the sites, they'll bring that to our team. They'll see if there's something we can approach in a more systematic way. If you're looking at, trying to make more of a case for it, again, I would go back to the leveraging the systems in place of, we're already, if a design system is already integrated across our website or mobile apps or whatever digital tools we're using, why not tap into that network that's already there and distribute this more widely than ask teams to do this individually and really take advantage of that efficiency that design systems and that kind of centralized distribution can take advantage of. And hopefully, the design system team, they can feel some of that passion for building an accessibility, because there's a lot of overlap with just making making something as usable as possible and also ends up being accessible. It really ends up in a better experience for everyone. So, kind of making that case as well for overall usability of a component or a pattern on a site.
Yeah, the system's key. I think that's one thing we found, like Maya's team and having Cedar kind of come before the actual accessibility team, I think has made a big difference, because you can make the case for a team to say, this could be your responsibility to fix this particular accessibility barrier, or you could use Cedar Design System because they've already accounted for it. And so I think, yeah, the system is really key. And getting people to recognize scale over like individual fixes, they'll start to be willing to help you create a scalable solution versus my one project, my one thing. And so I think that's the way we've sort of approached it, is trying to think big picture always, and then dialing into individual when we need to versus focusing on each individual barrier.
Excellent. Well, we are almost at the top of the hour. I think it's a good time to wrap up. Cooper and Maya, thank you so much for your presentation. I hope all of our attendees enjoyed it. I know I certainly did. But everyone can be on the lookout for this recording and for the resources and slides that we shared today. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.